This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this tutorial video, we'll be showing you how to make a T-top replacement cover. Sailrite has the supplies and tools that you need for this project and more. We will be making this top out of premium vinyl fabric called Stamoid top. The steps covered in this video will be measuring the frame, calculating for the materials, cutting the T-top to size, making facing strips and facing corners, basting those facings to the top. Facings are usually used in applications where double hems cannot take a corner because of a curve or a smooth transition. Sewing facings to the top. Sewing binding to the perimeter of the top using a binder attachment. Installing grommets around the perimeter. We will use two different tools, the press and snap tool and just a plain die set. Then finally, how to lace the T-top to the frame. Following the steps in this video will result in a T-top that fits beautifully on your frame. Sailrite carries many different brands of fabrics that make great T-tops. Brands like Sunbrella, Top.min, Top Gun, Weblon, Herculite, and more. We will be using Stamoid top, which is a vinyl fabric that is completely waterproof and considered a premium vinyl fabric that's often used in Mega Yachts. Let's get started. Measuring for the size of the T-top and also the fabric required only requires two measurements, a width measurement from port to starboard. For us, we have 56 inches. To confirm that it's a perfect rectangle, we'll measure at the bow from the port to starboard as well. Again, it's 56 inches from inner edge to inner edge. And then from stern to bow, or bow to stern, we need a length measurement. From inner edge to inner edge, our measurement is 76¼ inches. Here's a look ahead at the finished top. We just measured from inner edge to inner edge for the width and the length. Yes, the top will actually be smaller than those width and length measurements, but we're still going to use those measurements we just made to calculate for the amount of fabric that's required. The majority of T-tops do not have square corners, so here we're using cardboard and a marker and marking the shape of the corner. This is the bow. We want to also pattern the stern corner, at least one of them, to be assured that the corners are exactly the same. So again, we're using another piece of cardboard and we mark it stern. Now we'll cut one of the patterns out and confirm that it is the same as the bow side, and it is. So we only need to use one of these for each of the four corners. Now that we know the size of the frame, it's now time to calculate the materials that are required. We'll be using a premium vinyl fabric called Stamoid top from Sailrite. Stamoid top is 59 inches in width. We need to know that to determine the amount of fabric required. If the width of your T-top is less than or equal to the width of the fabric that you've selected, use this calculation to determine the amount of yards required for the top. Calculating for the actual top is fairly easy. But we also must add extra material for facings. The facings will go around the perimeter of the T-top to reinforce the grommet installation and also to reinforce the top itself. You may want to pause the video here to study these equations. Let's imagine that our top's width is larger than the width of fabric we've selected, so let's say 90 inches. In a scenario like that, fabric panels will have to be seamed together to meet the overall size required. In this scenario, when the width of the top is greater than the width of the fabric selected, you'll need to use these equations. You may want to pause the video here to study these calculations. Again, only use these calculations if the width of the top is larger than the width of the fabric selected. Here's the calculation for the amount of binding that you'll need. The binding will be sewn around the perimeter of the T-top. To be on the safe side, always order a foot or two extra. This T-top is made from Stamoid, so we're using a 3/4 inch Stamoid binding for it. To lace the T-top, we'll use number 1 Spur grommets. Here are the calculations to determine how many grommets are required to go around the perimeter of your top. And then finally, here are the calculations to determine the amount of line that's required to lace the T-top to the frame. We'll be using Leech Line Dacron, an 1/8 inch, available from Sailrite. Compared to what typically is used for lacing of T-tops, this line is a premium quality and will last for years. Here's a list of the materials that you will need, and what we used for this T-top is shown in yellow. In an effort to explain the build process, let's go over the 8 steps in making the top quickly. Your first step will be transferring the width and the length onto the fabric. However, the size of the top must be a 1/2 inch to 1 inch smaller on all sides. For our top, we decided to make all sides 1 inch smaller, so we'll subtract 2 inches from the frame size. Let's go over all the steps before we get started. Step 1 is to transfer measurements to the fabric. These are the measurements for the finished top size, and measuring diagonally from corner to corner ensures that we have a perfectly shaped rectangle. Step 2, cut the top out. Step 3, round the corners with your pattern and cut them away. We'll set the top fabric aside and concentrate on our facing fabric. Step 4, cut side facing strips. Step 5, cut corner facings. Since the corners of the T-top are typically rounded, facing strips that match the corner must be cut to size. Step 6, baste and then sew the facing strips and the facing corners in place. Step 7, sewing binding on. And Step 8, installing Spur grommets. Don't worry, all of these steps will be shown in detail in the following chapters. Let's cut our fabric to size. That's next. Now remember that the T-top fabric should be a 1/2 inch to 1 inch smaller on all sides. So our finished top size is 54 inches wide by 74 1/4 inches in length. After transferring those measurements to the fabric, you should also check diagonally from corner to corner to be sure that the fabric measures the same diagonally so that it's a perfect square or rectangle, depending on what it needs to be for your T-top. Then we can cut it out with scissors or, as we're doing here, with a rotary cutter and a cutting mat on the underside. Vinyl fabric does not need to be cut out with a hot knife since the edges typically do not unravel. But if you're using Sunbrella marine grade fabric or top-notch 9, you'll need to use a hot knife to cut the fabric out. We accidentally did not show measuring diagonally from corner to corner to be assured that our rectangle was perfectly shaped, but we highly recommend doing that. Now we have the rectangle cut to size. Next, we need to round the corners. Most T-tops have rounded corners. We'll use the pattern that we took off of the frame to create our corners. To mark vinyl fabrics like this Stamoid material, use a grease marking pencil, available from Sailrite. To mark Sunbrella fabric or top-notch 9 fabric, we recommend a chalk pencil or the soapstone pencil. Now cut the corners away. We will only show this on one corner. We're using scissors again on this vinyl fabric. If you're using Sunbrella or top-notch 9, use a hot knife. We'll set the top fabric that we just cut aside, and we will grab the excess fabric that we're going to make strips for facing out of. We like to use the clear acrylic ruler and cut these strips to 3 inches in width. They will be folded in half so that when they are placed on the top, we will install our fasteners through 3 layers of the fabric for extra reinforcement. When we determined the amount of fabric that was required, we also calculated for the number of facing strips that we needed. Here's that calculation if you need that again. For our T-top, we need 5 strips. Each of these 3-inch wide strips is equal to the width of the fabric that we've selected. Our fabric is 59 inches in width, so each of the strips are 59 inches in length. Utilizing more of that fabric, we will now mark and cut corner facings. You should still have some spare fabric that looks like a rectangle. Using the cardboard piece, we will mark the curve at each one of the 4 corners of this rectangular piece of fabric. This gives us 4 facing corners. Then, using your scissors or a hot knife if the fabric unravels, cut the corners off. To cut the rounded corners, we're going to use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler. To utilize that ruler well, we're going to use some masking tape and secure each one of the corner locations with the masking tape so the fabric won't move on us when we pattern it. Begin patterning with your pattern ruler at the straight portion before it starts to curve, and then pattern around the curve so that this line is completely parallel with the curved edge. Utilizing the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler like this creates a perfectly shaped edge that matches the cut edge we made previously. Our first mark was at 1 inch, and our second mark is at 1.5 inch. These two lines are for reference, where to insert the reinforcement strip and where to cut the relief slits. The final line is the cut line. It is placed 2 inches from the cut edge of the corner facing. We will repeat this for all 4 of the corners of this rectangular piece. The 2-inch line is the cut, the 1.5 inch line is the fold and slit line, and the 1 inch line is the fold to line. As we mentioned, the 1 inch and the 1.5 inch line are for reference. You may not want to draw those onto your corner facings. That'll be totally up to you. The 2 inch line is necessary. Now we'll cut each one of the 4 corners away. We're going to start cutting to where the curve transitions into a straight piece and just cut along the 2-inch line. After cutting all 4 corners, we'll have 4 corner facings. Still utilizing that fabric, we're going to cut one more corner facing piece. This one will be 1.5 inches wide. It'll be used to reinforce the corner so that we're going through 3 layers of fabric instead of just 2 with our grommet. From the spare fabric, again, we'll use our cardboard pattern and we'll place it at each one of the corners that were left over from our first corner cutout and mark the shape of that corner using that cardboard onto the fabric. Then we'll cut along that line, cutting away the excess at that corner. We'll do this for all 4 of the corners, and we'll use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler and mark a line parallel to the curved edge at 1.5 inches. Bill is using the weighted sandbags instead of tape to hold the fabric down as he uses the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler. Then he will cut this corner out, just like he did for the corner that was cut that's 2 inches wide. These corner facings are 1.5 inches in width, and we will need 4 of those. When we're done, we will have 4 that are 2 inches and 4 that are 1.5 inches. Facings have been cut, but now we need to prepare them for sewing to the top. We'll now call our attention to the straight facing pieces that we cut that are 3 inches wide. Our facing strips are 59 inches in length. That will accommodate the 2 short sides of our T-top, but it will not accommodate the longer sides. So we will use seam stick basting tape along the end of 2 of the strips and join them together to accommodate the 2 longer sides of our T-top. We'll peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and then just create a 1/2 inch overlapping seam. Stamoid top fabric has a distinctive outside surface and an inside surface. Right now the outside surface is facing down against the sewing machine, and we are sewing a straight stitch very close to the raw edge of the overlapping seam. We will sew this straight stitch all the way to the edge, and then we'll do some reversing back all the way to the beginning of our stitch, and that will complete the 2 halves together. There's no reason to create more than just this one stitch. Turning our attention to the corner facings, the 1.5 inch strip is placed on the top, and then the 2-inch piece is placed over top of that. This provides 3 layers of material for the installation of our Spur grommets. But before we do this, we need to baste this all together. We'll show you how to do that now. Let's baste the corner facings together, the 1.5 inch to the 2 inch. The corner facing that's 1.5 inches is just used for reinforcing the area where grommets will be installed. We will place seam stick basting tape along the long edges of the 1.5 inch piece on both edges. As the seam stick basting tape takes the curve, a few wrinkles will need to be placed in the seam stick to accommodate that curve. We will also place a row of seam stick basting tape along the bottom edge. This will ensure that the strip will stay in place as we take it to the sewing machine and sew. In fact, we can actually baste all 4 corners in place before we take it to the sewing machine and sew the corner facing and the straight facing pieces in place. The transfer paper has been removed, exposing the glue. Now we can baste that 1.5 inch corner piece to the 2-inch piece, and we want to baste it on the outside surface of those pieces. In other words, the outside surfaces of both pieces are facing up. You may be using a fabric like Sunbrella or Top.min that does not have a wrong side or a right side, so in those situations that will not matter. You'll notice when using double-sided tape with vinyl fabric like the Stamoid top that when the double-sided tape touches the vinyl, it sticks very well. And if it's not stuck in the appropriate position, it's a little bit difficult to unbaste it and rebaste it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be close. If the ends don't match up perfectly, no problem. Just trim them so they do. The facing strips that are straight will actually cover these corner facings. We will repeat this procedure for all 4 of our corners. Now we will place double-sided tape on the side that will fold back on top of the smaller strip. So double-sided tape will be placed on the outer edge of the 2-inch strip, and this 1/2 inch edge will be folded back on top of the 1.5 inch strip. Before we can fold that 1/2 inch portion over the top, we need to create some relief slits. We're going to start here at the center position. Now we don't want to cut these slits in while the transfer paper is on top of our double-sided tape. Otherwise we're going to have to peel off a lot of transfer paper in individual pieces. So we're going to remove the transfer paper from the double-sided tape, and then we're going to create our slits. Bill places slits about 1/8 inch apart, but you don't have to place them this close. They could be 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch apart and still work fine. Anywhere there's curve, there should be a few slits to allow the hem to sit flat when it's folded over. And now we will create that 1/2 inch hem. You may be asking, why not just create a double hem all around the perimeter of the T-top, and then we don't have to make facings at all? Well, that would be possible if the corners were not curved, if they were just 90-degree turns. Then we could just do the double hem with corner reduction. If we were to do a double hem on a curved corner, that corner would look pretty bad because you'd have a lot of excess wrinkles and you'd have to make slits that would probably be visible from the underside. So that's why we're making facings. Creating a facing strip that actually matches the curve of the corner is going to result in the most beautiful corner possible and reinforcement that's necessary for the Spur grommets. Bill's going to do some trimming here so they're all exactly the same since all the corners are the same. All we technically need here is the curved portion of the corner facing. The straight pieces that we cut earlier will actually rest over top of each one of these corner pieces at the ends. So only cut off the straight portion, don't cut off any curved portion. There we go. Next, we'll show you how to baste and sew those facings in place on the top. And now it's time to baste our facings in place. We're going to start with the corner facings. We're going to mark their location after positioning them at each corner. That way when we stick the double-sided tape on the corner facing, and because it sticks so well to vinyl fabrics, we'll know exactly where to position it and baste it in place. Now we'll apply the seam stick basting tape to the underside of our corner facing. We're going to apply it to both long edges, in other words, the curved edges on the inside and the outside. Now we're going to place our corner facing in the general location at the corner and start peeling off the transfer paper, revealing the glue. If you were using Sunbrella marine grade fabric or Top.min fabric, you could remove the basting tape completely from the corner facing and baste it in place. But with vinyl fabrics like this Stamoid top, The double-sided tape, that is, sticks so aggressively that we want to do it as carefully as possible, because once it touches, it's pretty much stuck down, and we want to try to remove as many of the wrinkles as possible so it sits nice and flat at the corner. Now we'll do this for all 4 corners. Once all of the 4 corner facings are in place, we can measure for the length of our straight facing pieces. We want them to overlap by approximately 1 inch or so. So this piece needs to be around 37 inches. Remember, we made some facing pieces that were longer for the long edges, and thus we have 2 long ones and 2 short pieces. We found a short piece and measured the desired measurement we want, placed a line, and we'll cut it there. We will not place a single hem on the ends of these facing pieces. So if you're using a fabric like Sunbrella or Top-Notch 9, which has a tendency to unravel, use a hot knife to cut it so the ends are sealed. Then we will fold our 3-inch facing pieces in half to create a 1.5 inch facing piece. In other words, this is doubled over. So now we have 2 layers of fabric that will go along the edge of our T-top to reinforce the installation of the Spur grommets. So our Spur grommet will go through 3 layers of our fabric assembly. Once it's creased, we'll open it up and we'll place double-sided tape along the edge of the crease and on the outer edge. And then when we fold it back, it'll stay stuck. It is important to note that the Stamoid fabric's correct side or outside surface is facing up. We're placing the double-sided tape on the outside surface. So when it is folded, the underside of the Stamoid fabric will be exposed. Thus it matches the underside of the T-top. Once the transfer paper has been removed, we can fold this facing in half. Now here's what it'll look like when we basted it to the top. So now we need to apply basting tape to the underside. Lots of basting tape is used, but because of the fact that we're using all this basting tape, we can baste it all together before we take it to the sewing machine and sew it. Because of that, things won't fall off as we're sewing edges. In other words, opposite edges will typically not fall away because of all the basting tape that was used. Now with Sunbrella, Top-Notch 9, Top Gun, other fabrics like that, seam stick doesn't stick as well, so you have to be a little bit more careful. Definitely still want to use the same amount of basting tape for those applications, but things may fall off because the seam stick doesn't stick as well as it does to this vinyl. Now, when we said we need to stick the underside, there is really no underside. We just stuck the basting tape on one of the sides of that facing strip. Both sides, whether it be the side that's facing up or the side that's facing down, are the same. We will baste it now to the T-top with the folded edge towards the inside of the T-top. The raw edge is facing towards the outside of the T-top. So the raw edge will have a binding placed on it later on. The inner edge has a nice completed, finished, folded edge. Looks great that way. And we are overlapping the corner facings by approximately 1 inch and basted in place. Yes, the ends are left raw. Vinyl has a tendency not to unravel, but other fabrics do. So use a hot knife if you're using a fabric that has a tendency to unravel. We're going to place the Sailrite tag on the bow end or side of the T-top. We're going to lift the facing strip, tuck it under there, and then when we sew that facing strip in place, the Sailrite tag will be affixed. The Sailrite tag indicates that this project was completed by a DIYer, do-it-yourselfer. We did not show basting all of the facing strips on the T-top, but they have been done. And now we can take it to the sewing machine. We will start sewing at one of the transitions between the straight facing and the corner facing, and we'll do some reversing there. And we are sewing the inner edge, not the outer edge, around the perimeter. And we are sewing approximately 1/8 inch from the fold of that edge. So take your time and go slowly here. We are sewing a straight stitch about 6 millimeters in length. We're using a V92 polyester thread and a size number 20 needle and the Sailrite Ultrafeed LS1 sewing machine. It is always a good idea to check for stitch tension. You should do that on some scrap fabric first, but you should also check that with the actual T-top when you start sewing. So don't sew too deeply until you check to make sure that tension is set perfectly. As we discussed earlier, the Sailrite tag is sewn in as we sew the facing to the top. When we reach a corner facing, we will continue just to sew around the perimeter, going slowly here so that we can follow the curved edge. The vinyl material is a little bit sticky, so Bill buries his needle here and he positions the fabric so that it moves easily when he sews around this corner. Take your time, keep your stitch as nice and straight as possible as you follow the curve. We will sew all around the perimeter like this, being sure that none of the facings fall off as we sew around the perimeter. That will not be the case with a vinyl fabric like this Stamoid top, but it could be the case with other fabrics like Sunbrella or Top 9 or Top Gun. The Sailrite Ultrafeed sewing machines are the world's best portable walking foot sewing machines. This Sailrite Ultrafeed LS1 has been placed in the Sailrite Ultrafeed collapsible sewing table. Vinyl fabrics like this are very sticky, and sometimes if you don't have a sewing machine with a walking foot like the Sailrite Ultrafeed sewing machines have, they can be troublesome to feed through sewing machines since the sticky fabric wants to stick to everything. But having a walking foot like on the Sailrite Ultrafeed sewing machine helps to make this job easy when sewing sticky fabrics like Stamoid top. Once we've sewn around the entire perimeter and did some reversing at the end, we did not show that, we want to come back to where each one of the straight facing overlaps the corner facing and do a straight stitch right on the edge of that overlapped section. So this is approximately a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch from that edge of fabric. We will sew all the way to where we sewed around the perimeter, and then we will reverse all the way to the outer edge. The outer edge will be covered in a binding, or a binding will be installed on that outer edge in the next step. We'll do this for all of those areas. Next up, we'll sew binding around the perimeter of our top. Sailrite recommends using a 3/4 inch bias binding to sew around the perimeter of the T-top. A 1 inch bias binding can also be used. Here we have attached the Sailrite 3/4 inch swing away straight binder to the Sailrite Ultrafeed LS1 sewing machine. To begin sewing, we start by doing a little bit of reversing, and then the job of the sewer is to be sure that the fabric assembly is pushed into the exiting point of the binder attachment as the binding is sewing on. The beauty of a binder attachment is you do not have to be concerned about folding the binding. The binder does that. All you have to be concerned about is pushing or feeding the assembly into the fold of the binder at the exiting point. So at the exiting point of the binder, he's being careful to push or feed the fabric assembly into where the binder creates the fold on the binding. If he were not concentrating on that, it is likely that his stitch would miss the fabric. When using a 3/4 inch binding, you have to be very attentive to pushing the assembly into the binder at the exiting point of the binder. If you are not, then the stitch may actually miss the edge of the top, and if that were the case, then the binding would not be attached at all there. When we reach the beginning point, what we do is we carefully sew so that the binding overlaps where we began sewing. Go slowly here, and again concentrate on pushing that assembly that is feeding into the binder well into the exiting point of the binder. So about 1 inch to 2 inches at this point, overlapping the first binding that was attached at the beginning, and then do a little bit of reversing. Then cut the binding from the binder attachment, trim your threads, and cut off the excess binding that overlaps the beginning binding. There we are. Binding is attached all around the perimeter. Installing number 1 spur grommets is next. We'll show 2 separate tools. The final task in creating your T-top is installing the spur grommets. The grommets will be used for lacing the T-top to the frame, and they're typically spaced anywhere from 4 to 5 inches apart. We believe 4 inches is best for best appearance and better lacing. The exterior flange of the grommet should be positioned close to the binding, but not so it overlaps the binding. Here we are using the Sailrite drill hole cutter, 3/8 inch for the number 1 spur grommet. Sailrite sells a variety of sizes of Sailrite drill hole cutters. The 3/8 inch size is perfect for the number 1 spur grommet. And on the underside, it is very important to use a cutting pad. Here we're using the Sailrite cutting block and die holder. We have folded the T-top material so it's resting on top of the opposite end, so we can easily mark locations for grommets on that after they're installed on the top layer. But we don't want to punch through both layers at the same time, so the Sailrite cutting block and die holder is placed between the 2 layers first, so we can install grommets in the first layer first and then the second layer after that. You'll have to create a lot of holes, and that'll fill up the cavity of the hole cutter. But there is a side port. You can use a screwdriver or an awl to push the scraps out and then continue to use it. We'll be demonstrating 2 different tools to install the spur grommets. The first one is the press and snap tool. We insert the male portion of the grommet through the hole of the fabric. Then the female portion with its teeth is placed on the opposite side. Now we'll use the press and snap tool with the number 1 spur grommet die sets installed in the press and snap tool. Those are sold separately from the tool. Depress the trigger of the tool and that sets the grommets. Again, the female portion on top. The male portion of the die set goes over the top of the fabric. Depress the lever and the grommet is installed. If the teeth are not buried well into the fabric, there is a thumb screw at the bottom of the press and snap tool that will engage or press the grommet more deeply into the fabric assembly. You can just turn that thumb screw. The press and snap tool and the number 1 spur die set for the press and snap is sold at Sailrite. Since the fabric is folded on top of itself, we can now use the grommets that we just installed and mark for the bottom layer that is folded directly in half to where the grommets will be installed on the opposite half of the T-top. An alternative tool to install grommets is a die set that you hit with a hammer. You still need to punch holes in the fabric assembly of where each one of the grommets needs to be installed, but now we're going to use a different tool. This is called a die set spur number 1 or 5/16 inch. Male on top of the anvil, male portion pushed through the hole, female portion with its teeth facing down over top of the male portion, then the tool placed through the center, and we give it a few blows with a mallet. We're using the Berry King mallet that's also available from Sailrite. 2 methods, the press and snap tool with the number 1 spur grommet die set for it, or the die set spur number 1. All that's left now is to lace the fabric top to the frame. In preparation for that, we will place the fabric onto the frame so that the facings that we sewed around the perimeter are facing down, so the outside surface of our Stamoid top material is facing up. We will then utilize zip ties around the perimeter, spacing them approximately every 2 foot apart, or 2 per corner. We will not tension them until we have the top fairly centered. Then we will draw them taut. No need to over tighten. They're just used to position the T-top at the appropriate position. Seal the end of the line with a hot knife or a lighter. This is an 1/8 inch braided Dacron line from Sailrite called leech line. On one end of the line, tie a figure 8 loop. First, create a bite in the line. Then create a loop. Continue around the back side with the loop. Then over and through the hole. This figure 8 loop will be used to tension the laced line around the perimeter of the top after it's been laced through all the grommets. To begin lacing, we'll lace from the bow or the stern end and pass the line through the centermost grommet from the underside. Then we will go around the frame and back through that grommet from the top side. Feed the end of the line through the next grommet from the underside. Then pull the excess line through. There's a lot of line, so this will take a little while. Continue feeding the line through your grommets. The figure 8 loop knot should come up against the first grommet, and hopefully it will not pull through the center of that grommet. Once all the excess line is passed through, you will pass the line around and over the frame and back through the same grommet from the top side. Then feed the line through the next grommet from the underside. Now pass the line around and over the frame and back through the same grommet from the top side. Pull the excess line through. Bill uses both his left hand and right hand. One hand is working out kinks while the other one is pulling the line through. He works back and forth doing this. Once the line is all fed through and the line is resting up against the underside of the facing, he'll pass the line up through the grommet, around the frame from the underside, down that same grommet, and then he'll pull all the excess line through. Because there's a long length of line that has to be pulled through, it looks kind of confusing. So we'll skip ahead and we will show lacing the remainder at the last corner. Because there's less line, it'll look a lot easier. First step, down the same grommet, up the next grommet, around the frame from the underside, pull the excess line, and then down the same grommet again, up the next grommet, pull excess line through, repeat. That's all there is to it. When we finally get around to where we started, we will take our line and we will tie it to the figure 8 loop. We will just tie a simple knot here. We are not completing the knot completely. We still need to go around and tension the line all around the perimeter, starting at the starting point. To do that, just grab the line that's resting over top of the facing strip on the underside. You can then work your way around the perimeter of the T-top, pulling on that line, working from grommet to grommet, working out any slack that may be in the line or areas of the top that may not be tensioned well. As we continue to tension all along the perimeter, the line will get longer and longer. And then when we finally get to the beginning point where we tied that knot, you should have quite a bit of excess line, maybe a foot to 3 foot of line, depending on how tightly you laced it at the beginning. But as you can see, as we tension it, the top is getting tighter. Now here we are coming to the beginning point where we tied that temporary knot, and we've pulled at least a couple feet of line through. So what we will do is we will tension it very tight here, hold on to our tension, and retie that knot. With the end of the line fed through the loop, we will tension it, and then we will create 2 half-hitch knots. Actually, it looks like Bill created 3 half-hitch knots. Now we can cut away all of the zip ties, being careful not to cut our line. We can cut away the excess leech line with the Sailrite Edge hot knife. If you don't have that, you can use scissors, then you can use a lighter or a wood burning tool to seal the end of the line. The T-top is complete. Notice that the way we laced the T-top, the edges of the top actually curve downward. This way water will run off nicely. If you lace it the other direction so that the line is sitting on top of the T-top, it would cup the fabric at the edges. This is an example of lacing the other direction. Notice the fabric cups so it'll catch rain. This top was fabricated from Sunbrella marine grade fabric. It too is beautiful. However, we prefer lacing it so that the line is on the underside, so the edges cup downward instead of upwards. The materials list and tools list is coming up next. You'll find many top quality marine vinyls like Stamoid Top, Sunbrella, Top-Notch 9, Herculite, Weblon Regatta, and Top Gun, all available at Sailrite. Here's a list of also all of the popular tools that we use throughout this video. If you have any questions regarding the materials or tools that we used for this top, be sure to give us a call or email us. We are glad to help with our professional advice. For more free videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the Sailrite YouTube channel and hit the bell to be notified of new videos when they become available, or check out the Sailrite website. Here are other videos that may be of interest to you. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.